There are birthplaces in the spiral, where children learn to field strip a beam rifle before they can sound out their names, where the lullaby is the shudder of distant guns, and the nightlight is the dim throb of orbital shields, riding the horizon like caged auroras. And Khazar Prime was one of those crucibles, a world braced across a breach in reality, the maps labeled the Violet Gate, not because it was pretty, but because anything that stepped through wore that color like a bruise, and everyone born under Khazar's wine-dark sky understood the math of their years the way farmers understand seasons, not whether death would come, but whether they could bargain a few more harvests from a ledger that always ended red. And so the regiments Khazar birthed were less armies than vows that walked upright. Iron drilled into bone until obedience felt like breath. Scattered across the cold rim were watchposts seeded by those vows. Not shining citadels, but boxy slabs of reinforced honesty, where the violet storms thinned enough for signals to thread the void. And one of them squatted in a basin of black ice under a sky that crackled with needles of static. Relay Kestrel 9, a communications bastion sunk into permafrost like a clenched fist, its antennae combing the heavens for traffic too stubborn to die, and the 88th Violet Gate troopers kept it so clean the metal smelled like law. 43 souls stripped down from a regiment once big enough to be its own weather. Survivors of sieges that ate their calendars and withdrawals that drew lines across star charts like scars. Posted here because someone in a far office thought they were spent rounds better stacked in a drawer than fired again. And someone in a near office knew better, but had no ink left to argue. Their captain was Rhea Varan, Khazar born in a hab that trembled whenever the shield lattice flexed against violet pressure. First memories lemon bitter with recaf and ozone. Second memory the drag of a rifle longer than her arms, until her arms grew to match it. And by 13 she could blindfold field strip the weapon and hold doctrine recitation in her head like a hymn. Eyes the deep amethyst that made strangers superstitious and comrades practical. Because Varan's gaze never rested where other people looked, always a little past the horizon, as if she were measuring the weight of enemies she could not yet see and rehearsing the math for how to cut that weight down. And the few times she smiled, it was a flicker that never reached those eyes, because affection was for the names carved in the barracks wall and the promises not to waste them. Second was Sergeant Jorik Fayen, skin written with old youth cohort marks, like a curriculum etched in scar. Not decorative, but documentary. Each line the receipt for a test paid in sleep or blood. The longest ridge earned in a coffin drill called Iron Vigil, where the point wasn't surviving hunger or thirst, so much as surviving your own head for 3 days under the weight of your breath. And Fayen had emerged with the steadiness of a metronome and a voice that bent panic into shape. The rest of the unit a cross-section of Khazar's working soul. Mara Corvin, who could coax warmth from frozen conduits using nothing but a spanner, and profanity that could blister paint. Petra Voss, who'd done her time as a white shield and stayed at a gun when the numbers said she should have run. And Felix Harrow, the medic, who had trained for clean clinics before the Violet Gate taught him that steady hands matter more when the ceiling is shedding dust and the floor is slick life on Kestrel 9. Wore grooves the way a river wears rock. Reveille at 500 under light that felt colder than the air. Drills that made muscles remember what minds forgot. Maintenance until the copper smell of lubricant replaced the smell of sleep. Then perimeter sweeps in 2s and 3s across a desert of glassed snow that boomed underfoot like distant drums. Then night school over hard bread where doctrine sat next to field improvisation, and history was something you studied with the same reverence you saved for the fallen. And when the day shut its eyes, they opened theirs to remembrance, reading the names etched on the concrete with a stencil and a knife, a litany layered so thick the wall looked like it had been rained on with alphabet. Because grief was a chore like any other, and chores kept you sane. Kestrel 9 itself was imperial by temperament, if not by pedigree. Slabs sunk 40 meters into crystalline permafrost, galleries armored to swallow shock like a boxer's gut, a transmitter tower that stabbed daylight and threaded night with tight beam stitches, even when the Violet Gate's tantrums rolled like summer thunder. Heat pulled from the planet's throat by a geothermal throat of pipes Corvin called the Dragon. Water shaved from polar ice with a taste like old iron. Shipments of shelf-stable not food that kept the body alive and the soul disciplined. And if you asked Varan whether she loved it, she would have said love was the wrong word. You didn't love a lock you were posted to guard. You kept it clean and you kept it closed. The first wrong note came on a Tuesday that had the honest sky of a liar. Voss out on Sector 7 walking a track so familiar. Her footprints from last week had become mirrors. When her receiver coughed out a distress beacon, the way a sick man coughs up a truth. Clipped, looping, corrupted like music drowned under surf, but clear enough to carry the bones of meaning. A civilian research arc requesting assistance 200 clicks northwest, repeating every 30 seconds as if no hand were left to touch the switch. And Varan did not float the question up the chain, because the nearest chain link was 6 months of quiet away, and doctrine that lives is doctrine that breathes. So she marked a route and broke the garrison into marching, not because hope is a plan, but because triage is. The crossing took 2 days measured in frostbite and sunburn, Icelock V changing moods the way a knife changes hands, brittle glare at noon, and a blue twilight that could freeze a thought in the time it took to have it. The squad moving bracketed in the standard Varan wedge. Voss and a quiet-eyed marksman named Dane scouting high on the teeth of pressure ridges, while the main column flowed in their shadow, and what had been a smudge on the horizon swelled into a ship that looked less crashed than interred, an old model ark driven into the permafrost at an angle that made the eye itch. Hull scored with burns where something had gnawed through shielding like acid patience. Beacons still dutiful, tight beam quiet. No handshakes, no voices, only the thin whistle of wind looking for edges to sing against inside. The air tasted sweet in the wrong way, like fruit left in a hot room until it decides to become something else. And the bodies were not exactly bodies anymore. And Harrow's detachment held because it had to. Because someone had to make lists that would be read later in rooms with better lighting. And what he wrote down did not feel like medicine. Growths like arguments sprouting from ribs, eyes blooming in places that were not faces, fingers that had decided they were tired of being 10 and wanted to negotiate for a larger number. Not random, but not math either. More like intention with the decimals misplaced, a pattern as if someone had tried to copy a human from memory and gotten bored halfway through. And the captain's log told a story with missing pages about storms that snuffed their shielding for seconds that were centuries long enough to let something touch and not politely leave. Varan pulled them back, with the economy of a knife sliding into a sleeve, not because there was anything to save here, but because there was still something to save back there. And the walk home stretched longer than the walk out, because time does that when you're carrying a weight you can't set down. And the first headache hit Dane behind the eyes like a flicker. Then colors that didn't have names, like the spectrum had kept a few shades secret and was now feeling generous. Then whispers that huddled just behind hearing. The alphabet rearranged into intestines, and Harrow did the ritual of tests because ritual is how you hold the line. Vitals fine, reflexes fine, blood fine, nothing fine. Varan quarantined the marksman behind medbay glass because the most dangerous plague isn't always a germ, and the most dangerous wound isn't always a hole. The array started misbehaving next, not by breaking but by performing too well at the wrong thing, handing back diagnostic sheets that read perfect while pouring poetry into the ether, in a language that looked like thunder translated into mathematics, a pulse that graph mapped like a sleeping brain drunk on dreams. And when Varan said pull the plug, the silence that followed had teeth, because absolute quiet in a place that always hums is a kind of noise, and into that vacuum crept footsteps without feet, and conversations without mouths, pages turning where the books had only blank leaves, because the manuals here lived in heads and on walls, not on paper. And Fian took the graveyard rounds because his scars had always been about test-taking, and something was administering an exam. The motion tracker read motion, where the corridor breathed only air. Cold pockets bloomed like bruises, where the thermostats were boringly faithful. And then the small betrayals began. A field watch from a man buried planets ago ticking on the common table. A half-smoked roll-leaf Voss had left in a trench, 4 campaigns back nestled on her bunk, as if habit had carried it there. Things displaced from before to now without transport, weighty, measurable, not illusions, and the unit gathered around them with the wary attention you give to a snake. You need to move without killing. Harrow offering a theory with hands open, not as verdict but as map. That stress and exposure can wake sleeping capacities, and sometimes those capacities bend the room when they move. And if someone had become a conduit without knowing it, then the polite thing would be to find who before it became impolite. That mystery refused to sit still, because the symptoms rained on everyone, not equally but widely, snatches of dream that felt borrowed, a shadow moving in the wrong direction in a corridor where the lights didn't lie. And when the night bloomed into worse, it did so almost kindly. Voss on com's duty, looking up to see a silhouette in the doorway that belonged to a comrade lost years back, but stretched as if the corridor were remembering him taller, and the face wasn't a face so much as the idea of one. A hole where light decided not to perform, and when it spoke it plucked a thread in her chest named guilt and made it vibrate. And the figure unmade itself like breath on a window when she reached for steel, and her report answered by voices that wore old names with new ease through circuits that should have known better. What followed was not a haunting by strangers, but a visitation by the past, not hostile by default, only unbearably familiar. Banter curling up the stairwells from empty rooms, wearing cadences that had been silent for years. Small complaints from the dead about the indignities of after, jokes too specific to fake, facts from after their deaths that overdrew the account of coincidence, and cameras caught them when eyes were too afraid to trust themselves, and fingerprints smudged on surfaces in patterns a forensics tech could diagram. The boundary between then and now fatigue cracked, and faith can carry you far, but physics prefers fences. And Varan felt on her tongue the taste of a decision that doctrine made simple and reality made hard. Because purging the contaminated is easy on paper, and difficult when the contamination looks like a friend smiling. They had a week of that thin ice before something heavy decided to jump up and down on it. And the warning was the sudden muting of the dead, like a crowd that catches sight of a procession, the air standing still, as if the station had held its breath on command, and then a voice arrived without traveling through the array or the walls. Bypassing equipment the way water bypasses a map, a voice smooth with the certainty of teachers who never raise their volume because they never expect disobedience, offering uplift in the language of family and progress, asking only that the troopers agree to define the world the way it preferred to define them. And Ria Varan did what she always did, with offers that arrived wearing perfume instead of credentials. She hit the big switch that makes a place into a fortress instead of a house, and told her people to get small, get dark, and get ready to stay that way. The first blows landed where flesh is softest, not the body but the story you tell yourself to make the day stand up. Visions custom cut to slip past armor. Varan back in a bunker, listening to outside noises sharpen into arithmetic. Fayen in the box again, except this time the box learned to shrink. Voss watching a corridor she had once held with a machine gun, while the math of how many she could save adjusted itself downward, offers following like sunshine after hail, strength with no ceiling, sight that never shakes, hands that close wounds like turning pages, an end to the mistake of being merely human. And it was Dane who stepped away first under that pressure, his eyes like coins polished with steel wool, saying they could give him back the thing the Ark had blunted, not just back but better. Accuracy like a law instead of a skill. And Varan's sidearm solved the argument before anyone could break faith by having to finish it slower. His death snapped something invisible, not a rope, but a net, the pressure lifting as if someone had opened a valve, and the corridor bent without moving, the station becoming a room they did not recognize, a chamber where the floor was gloss and the walls rose too far to be believable. A figure at center wearing height, the way a weapon wears heat, swathed in robes that twitched like equations trying to converge, where the face should have been a whirl of starfields like a wound you could fall through. And the voice that had arrived inside their heads used the real air now, and it sounded pleased with itself and bored with them, calling them children of a corpse throne they did not recognize, and inviting them to surrender the burden of choosing. And when it gestured, Mara Corvin's body remembered how a rumor becomes a story, and began to change in ways that made anatomy a suggestion. Additional limbs grew like edits. Jaws that didn't belong to the skull hinged out of the shoulder's dream of becoming something else. Claws like the punctuation of a sentence that never ends. And Corvin remained Corvin at the core of that new grammar, and taught the figure the old engineering term for pound sand. And it tore her apart as instruction and glued her together as demonstration, because nothing hurts quite like pain that cannot finish, and rage is a kind of calculus that simplifies everything. And Harrow moved like a man who knows he is small and has decided to be useful anyway, throwing steel that had never been meant to be thrown. Voss lit the air with white lines that made the figure blur. Fian put a grenade exactly where it wanted to be, none of which touched the center, but all of which made the room remember it was a room. The thing laughed with a sound like wind through copper cathedrals, but laughter with too much effort in it, because its certainty had met a surface with more friction than expected. And it tried the old argument about loyalty, spent on an economy that never pays dividends, about gods that don't answer, and masters that don't look up from their ledgers. And Varen stood with her pistol speaking fluent devotion that owed nothing to reward, the language of people whose oaths are not transactions but geometry, saying that protection is not a contract but a posture, that you wear your humanity like a uniform you mop yourself clean every night and put on again every morning. And for a moment the figure discovered surprise, which is an education all its own, and the architecture failed around it. Like a stage set struck at the end of a play, the station returned with a flinch you could feel in the soles, and with it came light that wasn't light. Presences that read like relief rather than threat, not the dead this time and not angels exactly, unless you choose your metaphors with generosity. Shapes that moved through the rooms like the memory of dawn, touching consoles that had been sulking until they purred, smoothing the grit from the air with a patience that felt earned. And one of them paused by Corvin, whose body had been arguing with itself, and decided in a moment to stop arguing and go back to being the machine she knew. Uniform mended where fabric had become story, scars edited until they spelled her name instead of what had been done to her. And the voice that accompanied that act spoke like command without domination. A reminder dressed as praise well done, it said without saying well done. You have been noticed by witnesses you did not know were watching, because that's when witnesses do their best work. And the cleaning finished not with trumpets, but with competence. The arrays talking only to the people they were supposed to talk to, the atmospherics settling back into their tidy lines, the planet acting less like a grudge. And when the lights dimmed back to ordinary, the visitors thinned the way fog thins when the sun remembers itself, leaving behind the kind of quiet that feels like a room adjusting to the weight of furniture, returned to its rightful place. And the dead stayed where the dead stay, and the living stayed where the living do their chores. And the unit's evening litany gained a name because ledger work does not stop for miracles or for funerals Varan filed, because officers file or they should not be officers, and the forms she used had as much room for what had happened as a pocket has room for a storm. So she wrote it the way the forms expected. Contamination encountered, appropriate cordon and purge procedures enacted, anomalous phenomena explained by stress, threat neutralized by discipline and doctrine. And somewhere warm and bored a clerk nodded, because nodding is the most powerful motion in bureaucracies and the cheapest. And the orders that moved them 3 months later smelled like ink and secrecy. A transfer to Detan Farms that sounded like a reward and tasted like exile. 6 months in transit under a gel field that for once behaved itself as if the universe wanted to show it could be polite when it chose. On the ship, Harrow found that scars had learned to forget the stories that made them. Teeth were new coins. Fatigue bled out faster than it used to, and Corvin's hands heard current in wires like distant music. Voss's sights tightened, as if probability had decided to stop arguing with her. Fian felt the moods of rooms the way other people feel drafts. Not magic, but a fitness learned overnight. And none of them could say when the learning had happened, because sometimes a gift is not payment, but equipment. Sometimes survival isn't the end of a test, but the issuing of a kit. And while the Deatan garrison duty hushed their days with the chores of food and freight, their nights curled around dreams like briefing packets signed by no one, rehearsals for enemies whose faces they could not fully bring into focus, even while they could list their habits. A future that smelled like ozone and turned metal, and because quiet never lasts past the part where you begin to believe in it. Recall orders arrived with the seal of people who do not sign their names. A rendezvous set by coordinates that hid inside other coordinates, the promise of transport flown by crews who wear their questions in their eyes and not on their tongues. And as they packed, Harrow saw code standing up from their genomes, like scaffolding someone had forgotten to take down after the building opened for business. Alterations that did not feel like corruption, but like the tightening of bolts that had worked loose, and the question of whether they were being rewarded or being prepared hung in the air not like a threat, but like an oath waiting for a mouth. And Varen listened to the ship hum and thought about locks and the people who sit on the right side of them and the people who try to rewrite the meaning of doors she slept badly the night before departure, and in that sleep stood on Khazar's ridge watching. The violet gate pulse like a wound that had learned to speak. Not falling this time but changing. Not invaded but persuaded. Code crawling across a sky that used to pretend to be empty. And the last thought she had before the dream unseated her was small and sharp and simple. That protection is a verb and not a spell. That you do it until you can't and then someone else does it. Because you taught them how. And when morning came, the light on, Deatan tasted faintly of iron and promise, and the kind of weather soldiers call good, because it lets the trucks make time and the rifles stay dry. And Relay Kestrel 9 was a star in a different sky by then, still humming to itself like a faithful dog, clean, closed, and waiting. The orders had arrived wrapped in an encryption so dense it looked less like text and more like a cage built from language. And when Captain Varan keyed it open, the characters that unfolded across her screen shimmered as though they resented being read. The authorization sigils bore no regimental heraldry, no familiar wax of command from Sector High, only the Triarch symbol used by departments whose names were spoken in whispers by clerks and never written by soldiers. The message gave them 72 hours to transfer garrison duties to local defense militia and report for immediate redeployment to a classified location. Coordinates buried behind cipher layers older than the Imperium's founding myths. No explanation, no reason, just a destination wrapped in secrecy that smelled like both promotion and punishment. Varan read it twice, then once more for luck, though luck had stopped taking her calls long ago. The 88th packed with the methodical calm of people who had seen too many goodbyes masquerading as transfers. Crates were weighed, sealed, stacked in geometric patterns that comforted soldiers who measured sanity by symmetry. Fayen oversaw the inventory, ticking every box against the manifest, with the dry patience of a man who trusted paperwork more than mercy. Corvin muttered at her tools, polishing the wrenches until they gleamed like arguments waiting to happen. Voss lingered near the firing range, putting shots into the same hole until the target paper looked more like philosophy than practice. Harrow spent his hours combing through the last of their medical files, cross-checking anomalies that had been too subtle to matter until now. Cellular regeneration too clean, immune responses too quick, fatigue recovery charts that curved upward like promises they had not made. Each discovery felt less like fortune and more like someone else's handwriting appearing inside their bodies. The transport arrived at dawn. A slate-grey Corvette bearing markings that shifted when the light changed, as if the paint itself refused to be catalogued. Its pilot, a scar-stitched veteran whose eyes glittered like ship lights seen through fog, greeted them with the cordial silence of someone paid to notice nothing. Boarding was brisk. There were no welcomes, no briefings, only acceleration couches smelling faintly of antiseptic and old secrets. When the clamps disengaged, Kestrel 9 shrank below them into a pale scar across the ice, the antennae stabbing skyward like the bones of something that had died kneeling. Voss stared until the planet's curvature swallowed it whole, and in that instant, felt the peculiar grief of leaving behind a place that would outlive her memory, but not her footprint. Warp transition came smoothly, which should have been the first warning. The Gelfield pulsed steady, the engines sang in tune, and the usual nausea of unreality never arrived. Space folded around them as politely as a curtain closing after applause. Days blurred into drills, routine maintenance, meals that tasted more of chemical balance than flavor. Yet beneath the monotony was a hum too deep to hear but easy to feel, a vibration that lived behind the breastbone, pulsing in rhythm with the ship's reactor, as though the vessel itself had learned to breathe. Varan kept her observations to herself. Leadership meant letting fear die of neglect rather than nourishment. Harrow's medical rounds turned from routine to revelation. Every member of the unit showed physiological anomalies that refused classification. Muscular density increased by measurable degrees. Scar tissue vanished as if rewritten by hindsight. Neural response times edging toward inhuman precision. He logged the data, encrypted the files, and avoided mirrors because his reflection seemed to blink half a heartbeat after he did. When he finally confessed to Varan, her only response was a nod heavy enough to count as confession itself. "We've been modified," she said, the words dull as ordnance reports. "The only question is whether it happened by mercy or by design." On the 13th day of translation, the ship's long-range augers found something that should not have existed, a shape moving parallel to them, neither ahead nor behind, gliding through the immaterium as if currents obeyed it instead of the other way around. The readings came fragmented, silhouettes wrapped in static, size indeterminate yet vast enough to register on gravitational sensors designed for worlds, not vessels. The captain ordered a course shift. The Phantom followed, precise and patient, its wake leaving trails of impossible numbers that made machine spirits stutter in panic. Even the warp's madness seemed to bend politely around it. When the corvette finally tore free into real space, the stars looked wrong, closer, brighter, hung in patterns that suggested deliberate arrangement. Thayan checked the charts twice before admitting they were nowhere near their intended coordinates. The system ahead was unmarked, its sun pale and trembling, its planets arranged like stones in ritual geometry. At the outer edge drifted a single black sphere the size of a city, smooth as obsidian and entirely without reflection. It emitted no signal, no light, no invitation, yet the corvette's controls aligned toward it as if pulled by etiquette more than gravity. The pilot cursed once under his breath, words too old for translation, and then the comm channel filled with a voice identical in cadence to Varan's own, giving docking clearance codes that none of them had transmitted. The approach was silent. No beacon lights flared, no tractor beams engaged, only a soft tremor through the hull as magnetic seals embraced them with mechanical affection. The docking bay beyond opened like the throat of a god that had forgotten how to pray. Inside waited nothing. No crew, no servitors, only corridors lined with dark panels that absorbed light rather than reflected it. The air tasted of copper and electricity and something older, like dust from books written before language decided on rules. Varan ordered a standard advance formation, weapons ready, comms on low-band whisper. Their bootfalls echoed oddly, each sound repeating a fraction too late, as if the station were rehearsing what reality was supposed to sound like. They followed the voice that guided them deeper, sometimes speaking through intercoms, sometimes from directly behind them, always using their own tones, saying their own names, promising explanations just ahead. Every turn revealed architecture that defied classification, angles that bent inward and outward simultaneously, walls veined with filaments pulsing like veins under translucent skin. Corvin traced a finger along one conduit and jerked back, swearing it had pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. Harrow scanned the air and found particulate traces, not of dust but of coded proteins, as if the entire structure was alive in a very polite, very patient way. Finally, they entered a hall shaped like a cathedral, melted and recast by an engineer, who only understood mathematics through dreams. At its center stood a dais, bearing a single object, a containment cylinder filled with shimmering liquid that defied color, sometimes silver, sometimes violet, always wrong. Suspended within was something that looked almost human, yet not assembled correctly, features rearranged along new axes, symmetry too perfect to be comfortable. The voice spoke again, this time from everywhere, layered like choir and machinery combined. "Welcome home, Violet Gate Troopers. You have returned to the womb that made you." The words froze them more effectively than gunfire. Home was a word soldiers avoided unless drunk or dying. Varan stepped forward, weapon steady. "Identify yourself." The lights dimmed in response, revealing faint silhouettes along the walls, tubes filled with the same liquid, each holding a shape disturbingly familiar. Faces repeated, their faces, multiplied and sleeping, variations of themselves in earlier stages of formation. The station was a mirror factory printing souls from templates that had forgotten the concept of uniqueness. Harrow's instruments screamed under data overflow, readings leaping off the scale into regions labeled simply impossible. He saw his own pulse matching the frequency of the containment field, every heartbeat echoing in the tanks around them. Corvin tried to sever the main power feed. Sparks erupted, but the lights grew brighter, fueled by defiance rather than energy. Voss whispered a prayer to the Emperor, and the echo answered her back with the same prayer one breath ahead, as if faith itself were being rehearsed by a mimic. Varen realized then that whatever intelligence ran this place was not trying to kill them. It was trying to finish them, to complete a design paused mid-sentence. The genetic anomalies Harrow had documented were invitations, not infections, call and response sequences meant to awaken when near their source. The shimmer in the air thickened, her skin crawled with the pressure of invisible fingers, rearranging molecules that had grown comfortable where they were. She shouted orders, voice breaking command into rhythm. Fall back, Formation 3, target the conduits. The troopers obeyed on instinct older than fear. Lasfire stitched the walls, rupturing veins of violet light that bled energy like ink into water. The chamber screamed, an acoustic impossibility born of metal and pain. Then came silence, not peace, but the silence of systems holding their breath. The light steadied to a human hue. The containment tubes cracked, leaking the silver-violet fluid across the floor where it hissed and evaporated into nothing. The voice returned, smaller now, like a wound learning humility. You resist completion. Yet completion is inevitable. Varan's reply was cold enough to frost steel. Completion is surrender, and we don't surrender. The figure inside the central tube opened its eyes, her eyes, and smiled with the patience of something that measures time in centuries. The station began to rotate, gravity shuddering as if the concept itself were reconsidering loyalty. Outside the viewport, the black sphere unfurled into segments, revealing within it a lattice of light that mapped constellations unknown to imperial charts. Energy signatures bloomed, vessels hundreds, maybe thousands, rising from dormancy like predators sniffing dawn. The corvette's pilots screamed over comms for extraction clearance, but the docking clamps refused every command. They were prisoners not of metal, but of design. Thyan found the emergency demolitions pack, primed it, and looked to Varen for confirmation. She nodded once. The explosion tore the docking gate apart, venting atmosphere and excuses alike. The squad hurled themselves back into vacuum, mag clamps, catching the corvette's hull as alarms wailed symphonies of protest. The pilot burned engines without waiting for pressure equalization. Behind them, the black sphere folded upon itself like a closing eye, its fleet of newborn shadows dispersing into the void toward imperial space. When the warp drive engaged, reality tore open obligingly, and for a heartbeat the troopers saw into the gap between universes, a glimpse of a network of similar spheres pulsing in distant sectors, synchronized like a heartbeat too vast to belong to any living thing. Harrow whispered that they had just watched the first breath of a war that hadn't been declared yet. Varan said nothing. Some truths didn't survive being spoken. The return to sanctioned imperial space should have felt like surfacing from drowning, but it felt instead like waking inside the same dream, just in another room. The corvette's systems flickered with exhaustion. The warp drive wheezed like a sick animal, and the pilot's knuckles were white around levers that were supposed to rest at neutral. When the nav beacons finally aligned with recognizable constellations, the crew exhaled in unison. A single heartbeat spread among many bodies. Varen didn't. Relief was a resource she rationed like ammunition. They were alive. Nothing more, nothing less. The black sphere and its fleet were gone from their scopes, but her instincts told her that absence was not safety, only silence playing dress-up. They made orbit around a barren administrative moon whose surface looked like ash poured over glass. The Inquisition facility there was an iron bruise against the horizon. No windows, no insignia, a structure that hated questions almost as much as it hated light. Docking clearance arrived unprompted, coded with priority protocols beyond anything in the guard's chain of command. A voice, cold, educated, perfectly polite, ordered them to disembark unarmed. That command was technically impossible for E5. Soldiers bred to sleep beside their rifles, but they complied, weapons sealed and tagged, because when the Inquisition says unarmed, it usually means alive a little longer. The reception chamber was a study in contradictions. Sterile walls scored with the faint scratches of long arguments, the scent of incense failing to hide sterilizer. 3 figures waited at the center, a robed inquisitor, whose face was shadowed by augmetic halos, a silent scribe with data cables trailing from her skull like roots, and an astropath whose milky eyes flicked between the troopers as if reading names tattooed on their bones. Varun snapped to attention. The Inquisitor's voice had the texture of a knife scraping ink. You were stationed at Kestrel 9. You encountered a non-catalogued phenomenon. You destroyed a classified installation. Confirm. The captain's answer came flat and perfect. Confirmed. The questioning lasted hours, measured by thirst and by the sound of data slates stacking. Every detail was requested, recorded, repeated. The Inquisition did not want a story. They wanted coordinates, pulse readings, and evidence to justify executions. Harrow presented his medical logs. Fian outlined tactical timelines. Corvin described the architecture of the Black Sphere with the precision of an engineer trying not to remember what she'd seen. The Inquisitor listened without expression, every note transcribed into the machine mind of the scribe. When it was done, he offered no verdict. You will be contained for debriefing and purity assessment. Compliance ensures leniency. Defiance ensures discovery. The sentence sounded rehearsed because it was. Isolation cells were not new to the Violet Gate troopers, but these were built to hold possibilities, not people. The walls shimmered faintly, suppressing psychic resonance, distorting reflections into half-faces. They were fed bland sustenance through vents, examined by servitors whose eyes glowed with pity someone had forgotten to remove. Days, or perhaps weeks, passed in rhythms too regular to measure time by. Dreams came vivid, Khazar's violet sky pulsing in slow heartbeats, voices whispering from inside her armor's plating. Varan awoke with bruises shaped like questions she hadn't asked yet. When they were released, it was not because they were cleared. It was because someone higher up the chain decided they were more useful moving than rotting. The Inquisitor's replacement, a woman named Merith Alai, met them in a briefing room draped with purity seals like warning labels. She was younger, eyes sharp with curiosity that hadn't yet been punished into caution. "You're being reassigned," she said, sliding a holomap across the table. "There's an outbreak of signal corruption near the Callian Rift. We need soldiers immune to infection." Varan didn't bother hiding her suspicion. "And you? Think that's us?" Alai smiled the way teachers smile before an impossible test. "You've already survived exposure once. Either you're immune or you're proof." The mission parameters were precise in their vagueness. A listening post on the edge of the rift had gone dark, broadcasting pulses that resembled both distress calls and lullabies. Contact attempts failed. Satellite images showed shifting topography, as if the landscape were dreaming itself into new shapes. Their orders were simple: land, investigate, report, and if necessary, cleanse. Cleanse was Inquisition dialect for erase every witness, including yourself. The troopers accepted the directive with the same stoic nods they used for prayer. Duty was not a choice. It was a language they spoke fluently. The transport assigned to them was older than their regiment, its hull etched with campaign scars, older than any of their memories. During the week-long journey, the strange enhancements they'd noticed aboard the corvette intensified. Voss could see through the darkness of the rift, like a hawk tracking prey by heat. Corvin felt magnetic currents hum through bulkheads and steered by instinct when navigation failed. Fian's empathy bled into perception. He could sense danger seconds before alarms registered it, and Varan, though she said nothing, began to hear patterns in the static between words, a rhythm that sounded suspiciously like command. They arrived at the coordinates of the missing outpost to find only fragments of metal, half buried in black dust. No signal, no bodies, just silence coiled so tightly it felt predatory. The ground pulsed faintly under their boots, not alive exactly, but attentive. Harrow's instruments failed within minutes, readings fluctuating between impossible extremes. Then, without warning, the sky peeled open in a seam of violet light, and through it descended structures that were not ships but ideas given geometry. Constructs of glass and muscle, dripping with the same silver-violet essence they'd seen in the sphere. The war they'd escaped had followed them home. The first wave hit fast, shapes moving on too many legs, speaking in radio static that translated into pleas for help when filtered through comms. The troopers responded with the efficiency of instinct. Voss rifles sang coherent beams that carved through bodies that reassembled before finishing their collapse. Corvin rigged plasma charges in patterns resembling prayers, detonations folding the air like fabric. Harrow moved among them, stitching wounds that closed before his hands left, his scalpels gleaming like confessions. For every monstrosity that fell, two more crawled from fissures in the ground, their forms echoing human silhouettes, echoes of the 88th themselves, distorted but unmistakable. Varan realized with dawning horror that the enemy wasn't cloning them. It was predicting them, manifesting possibilities carved from their own fear and memory. The more they fought, the more accurate the imitations became. Her own double stepped from the smoke, eyes perfect mirrors of her own, rifle raised in an identical stance. The duel that followed was less combat than confession. Each movement mirrored until she fainted not with strength, but with hesitation, something no algorithm of perfection could anticipate. Her shot burned through the replica's skull, releasing a burst of violet mist that smelled like memory itself evaporating. The battle raged until dawn painted the rift's horizon in poisonous light. When silence returned, the ground was carpeted with half-formed bodies dissolving into liquid geometry. Harrow's medical senses blinked red from overexertion. Voss' rifle barrel smoked dull orange. Fian crouched, touching the cooling earth, his voice soft. "They weren't attacking," he said. "They were practicing." Varan looked to the horizon, where the shapes of distant spires rose from the rift like teeth breaking through skin. "Then we'd better learn faster than they do." They established a temporary perimeter among the ruins, knowing full well that temporary was often a euphemism for final. When the night came again, it brought not dreams but messages, whispers threading through the vox channels in their own voices, giving coordinates they hadn't requested. Each location pointed deeper into the rift, toward the heart of the distortion. The Emperor's faith teaches that obedience is purity. Varan, veteran of too many miracles and mistakes, understood that sometimes disobedience was survival. Still, at dawn she gave the order to move, not because she trusted the voices, but because standing still had never saved anyone worth remembering. The route deeper into the rift was not a path so much as a choice the world accepted on their behalf. The terrain warped from rock to glassy ridges that rang when struck, as though the planet were a bell tuned to a key no human ear could quite hold. Compass bearings spun lazy circles. Distance lost its manners. Every kilometer they advanced rewrote the map behind them. Ridges erased, valleys rearranged. Corvin stopped updating coordinates. Even machines deserve mercy when geometry lies. The squad moved by instinct, trusting the pull in their bones more than their instruments, that faint vibration behind the heart that hummed in time with the violet glow thickening on the horizon. Harrow took samples of the air and found traces of neurotransmitters where oxygen should have been, as though the atmosphere itself were alive, breathing in their emotions and exhaling reflections of them. He warned Varan that prolonged exposure could blur memory, confuse self and surroundings. She answered by reciting service codes, the litany of Khazar drilled into every Cadian child born under violet skies. Words became anchors, serial numbers, oaths, weapon maintenance checklists, anything to keep their minds tethered to the real. Fayen whispered each line like prayer, feeling the air ripple when syllables of faith cut through the ambient murmur of whatever intelligence listened from below. By the third night, sleep turned traitor. Dreams arrived in chorus, synchronized across the squad. They stood together in a city of bone towers, each tower a vertebra stacked upon another, each whispering in their voices. The city spoke of ascension, of merging purpose with perfection, of abandoning weakness disguised as flesh. When Varan woke, she found her armor's servos moving half a second before she thought to command them, as though the dream had taught the machine a new hierarchy. She stripped the power pack, forced a reboot, and whispered to the sleeping metal, "You served me, not the other way around." The armor obeyed, but its silence sounded sullen. At dawn, the ground ended. Before them yawned a canyon wide enough to cradle a hive city, its depths lit by a pulsing lattice of light. Structures hung suspended on invisible tension, bridges of luminescent filament, towers that leaned inward like conspirators. In the center floated a sphere of liquid brightness, identical to the one from the Black Station, only now awake, its surface rippling with the faint silhouettes of faces that flickered like candle shadows. Varan knew without proof that those faces were theirs. Possibilities drawn from the station's stolen data, from the samples taken during purity assessment. The Inquisition hadn't destroyed the contagion. It had delivered them to it. They descended on grav lines, each meter heavy with the feeling of being watched not from above, but from within. At the base waited a dais carved from the same impossible alloy as the sphere's casing. Upon it stood a figure in inquisitorial armor, painted the color of mourning. Merith Alai's voice carried through the static with unsettling calm. "Welcome, Captain. You've brought back what was lost." Varan raised her rifle, words flat. "You sent us here." The Inquisitor's smile was not denial, it was pride. "The Emperor's design demands evolution. You are prototypes, not soldiers." The violet gate was never a barrier. It was a door, and doors are meant to open. Behind Alai, the sphere convulsed, streams of liquid light reaching out like roots. Fayen felt emotions radiate from it. Joy, hunger, expectation. Harrow's instruments spiked into nonsense. Corvin hurled a plasma charge, the explosion rolling across the cavern like thunder trapped in stone. When the smoke cleared, Alai still stood untouched, the energy curling harmlessly around her outstretched hand. "You cannot kill an idea," she said softly. "You can only complete it." The sphere brightened, and the cavern answered with a heartbeat felt rather than heard. The transformation began with the light bleeding into them through their pores. Voss screamed first, not in pain but in revelation, her eyes burning silver as her aim extended beyond sight. Corvin's veins traced circuitry under her skin, glowing patterns matching the sphere's rhythm. Harrow collapsed to his knees, his hands emitting faint halos as he touched the ground. The dust turned to living tissue where his fingers passed. Fayen shouted over the rising noise, his voice echoing twice, once in his throat, once from the sphere. "It's copying us again. No, it's finishing us." Varan fought the surge, digging her boots into the trembling floor, forcing breath through clenched teeth. "We are not your design," she snarled, raising her rifle and firing into the sphere's core. The blast didn't wound it, it woke it. A column of radiance burst upward, carving a hole through the planet's crust, releasing a beam visible even in orbit. Through that wound spilled shapes of pure geometry, constructs humming in chorus, spreading across the cavern walls like reflections multiplying. Every surface became a mirror, showing futures that weren't supposed to happen. In one, Varan saw herself leading legions of hybrid soldiers. In another, she was ash scattered across a battlefield that didn't yet exist. Choice had become a spectrum. Alai stepped closer, her face illuminated by the merging lights. "You were never meant to die nameless on frozen worlds. The Emperor's divinity is the potential within humanity to remake itself. You are proof that the gate opens both ways." The words wrapped around them like prayer shawls of reason, twisted into faith. Varan met her gaze, steady, unflinching. "The Emperor tests. He doesn't bargain." She triggered the detonation beacon slaved to their dropship's reactor. "Let's see which of us passes." Light consumed everything. No explosion, no heat, just brightness folding the rift inward like paper, closing over flame. In the final instant before the world vanished, Varan thought she heard the echo of Khazar's artillery lullaby, the rhythm that had trained her heartbeat since childhood. The gate pulsed once more, not closing, not opening, merely remembering. When light surrendered at last, it left behind not darkness but stillness, the quiet aftermath that follows a heartbeat too strong for the chest that held it. The rift was gone. Where once a canyon had clawed open the planet's skin, now stretched a plain of fused glass smooth as calm water, reflecting a sky unscarred by violet. The dropship's wreckage lay half-melted at the perimeter, its reactor core spent, its shadow etched into the ground like a signature burnt on parchment. Of the sphere and its impossible architecture, no trace remained, only the faint hum of something buried beneath logic, still alive in silence. Imperial survey drones would later measure the area and find magnetic resonance patterns, shaped exactly like human fingerprints, overlapping in concentric circles. They called it residual energy. Hera would have called it memory. Varan woke first, throat raw with a taste of ozone. Her armor was half gone, fused into her skin like a second layer of resolve. Around her lay the remnants of her unit, motionless but intact, their bodies radiating a faint luminescence that faded with every breath of wind. She rose to her knees, the horizon swaying like a drunk remembering how to stand. "Report!" she croaked. The word fell into the air and returned an answer from nowhere, Voss's voice calm and steady, alive. One by one they stirred, each different in small, disquieting ways. Corvin's pupils reflected circuitry. Harrow's touch left trails of bioluminescence across the sand. Fian's gaze flickered, as though he were seeing more than one timeline at once. Varan herself felt heavier and lighter simultaneously, aware of every atom that had survived and every one that hadn't. They gathered in a ring as dawn bled thin gold across the fused plain. No comms, no orbital response. The Inquisition ship that had delivered them here was gone, either vaporized in the blast or fled from what it had unleashed. For the first time in their lives, the Violet Gate troopers were free of command, and the absence of orders felt like sacrilege. Harrow scanned their vitals and shook his head slowly. "We shouldn't be alive," he murmured. "By every measurable law, we died in that blast." Varan looked at the shimmering horizon. "Then we're beyond measurement now." They set camp at the edge of what had been the rift, improvising shelter from twisted hull plating. Food rations dissolved into powder when exposed to air. They didn't need them anyway. Hunger had become a memory instead of a requirement. Days passed uncounted. Time behaved politely but not honestly. It stretched and folded like fabric caught in wind. They stopped aging, stopped tiring. Dreams returned, though not as visitors but as architects, shaping their perceptions into blueprints for something larger. In those dreams, the Emperor's visage appeared not as a god on a throne, but as light refracted through countless human forms, each carrying a piece of his fire. It was not revelation. It was recognition. Weeks later, or perhaps hours depending on whose clock you trusted, the first Imperial patrol arrived. A reconnaissance frigate, descending through low orbit, picked up their life signs and dispatched shuttles, flanked by priests and purity servitors. The rescue team approached with weapons half-raised and prayers spilling from Vox amplifiers. When they saw the troopers, their courage faltered. The survivors' eyes glowed faintly in the dark. Their skin bore tracery of light like scripture, written beneath the surface. The sergeant of the patrol stammered a question about identity and allegiance. Varan's answer was simple. "We serve the Emperor. Always have." The statement satisfied no one, but fear makes paperwork hasty. They were taken aboard under quarantine, catalogued as both witnesses and contamination. Interrogations resumed. New faces, same questions, sharper needles. This time the Inquisition asked not what they'd seen, but what they'd become. Harrow's medical scans defied explanation. Every cell humming with energy signatures that matched neither warp mutation nor sanctioned augmentation. The priests called it heresy, the Magi called it evolution, and both sides wrote conflicting reports in the same ink. The troopers were relocated to a classified research bastion, orbiting an uncharted world. There, under constant scrutiny, they waited for verdicts that never came. Experiments confirmed what they already knew. Wounds closed instantly, reflexes surpassed human thresholds, and psychic nulls failed to suppress their awareness. They were still human, just inconveniently better at it. Varan spent her confinement staring at the stars through reinforced glass, watching them shift color in patterns that reminded her of the sphere's pulse. At night, she heard whispers through the ventilation, voices she recognized as her squad even when they were asleep in separate cells. The connection between them had survived every attempt to sever it, a network woven not by technology, but by shared defiance. They could feel one another's thoughts in outline, like silhouettes behind fog. When she focused, she could even hear the faint beat of artillery. Khazar's long-dead lullaby, steady and unyielding. Then one night, the alarm stayed silent. The power grids flickered, lights dimmed, locks disengaged as though responding to unseen command. The troopers emerged from their cells without plan or signal. The guards lay unconscious but unhurt, their eyes rolled back in dreams too deep to disturb. The corridors guided the squad toward the docking bays, doors opening before they could touch them. In the hangar waited a ship they had never seen, a corvette bearing the insignia of the Violet Gate, though that mark had never officially existed. Its engines glowed the same shade as their eyes. Fine turned to Varan, expression caught between dread and destiny. "They're calling us again." Varan checked her weapon, though she suspected she'd never need it again. "Then we answer," she said. The vessel left orbit without clearance, vanishing into a warp transition so smooth the sensors missed it entirely. Records show only a brief distortion, a spike of violet energy shaped like a heartbeat. After that, nothing. The Inquisition sealed the incident under the highest secrecy, classifying the Violet Gate troopers as lost in action, presumed purged. But on a dozen distant worlds, Vox operators later reported hearing faint transmissions that did not match any known code. Short bursts of static repeating a single phrase, "The Emperor endures through those who evolve." Whether the message was blessing or warning depended on who was listening. For the troopers, now part flesh, part light, it was both. They became myth whispered along the front lines, a regiment that walked between life and legend, appearing where the veil between realities thinned, fighting battles no one recorded. Some claimed to see them during the defense of worlds later saved from extinction, their eyes burning violet, their movements too precise to be mortal. Others said they were ghosts, echoes of soldiers who refused to die properly. The truth, as ever in the Imperium, hid somewhere in the fog between faith and fear. And in that fog, Captain Rhea Varan, once human, once mortal, now something else entirely, kept her vigil. She remembered Khazar's shattered skies, the frozen quiet of Kestrel 9, the faces of those who'd fallen along the way. Her duty had not changed, only the tools had. She whispered her final prayer to the stars, a soldier's benediction stripped of ceremony. The Emperor protects. Somewhere beyond the edge of known space, the Violet Gate pulsed once, softly, rhythmically, as if answering her back.